So this is PI 170, Chapter 4. It's on evolution. And if you can't read it, it says, if people evolved from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys? And the other one saying, if Americans came from English pilgrims, then why are there still Englishmen? And it's a pretty good answer to the question that people often put up. And Bob goes, is our children learning yet? So I have been informed, and I'll tell you this the first day, but I've just been informed, so that although I'm in the lab and the building's open, apparently you can't come in at an off time when I would be alone in the room and you wouldn't be running into anybody without clearing it with, well, letting me know, and then I'm supposed to clear it with people. I'm sure if you stopped at the public safety office and said you were here to see me, they would, clear you to do it. But apparently, walking into a virtually empty building at these off hours when there are no labs being done, nobody does labs during these hours. Well, maybe in the mornings. There's not a lot of labs being done, but there's restrictions on coming to see me. But you can come to see me if you let us know ahead of time, and I'll just tell them, somebody's coming to see me. And then, I don't know. Anyway, evolution. Can you tell the bureaucracy and the rules are starting to annoy me? As I have a tendency to do, I tend to take an historical approach here. Evolution, as we covered in the first chapter, is a change in populations over time. Okay. Hopefully that makes it easier to see the screen. Little trick I picked up on the internet checking for things. Now keep in mind that for a very, very long time, the only real history people had was oral history passed down through who knows how many generations. And when you're depending on oral history, your history doesn't go back very far. And it just goes back through people, your ancestors who are like you. So as far as anybody knew, the world that they existed in was the world that had always been. And so when they tried to decide how the world started, they had to come up with an explanation for how it formed in this complicated situation. So, of course, their view of the past was, it poofed into existence and it pretty much has always existed this way with some minor changes. When they started to dig up fossils, they would find these big bones turned into rock. There's a bit of mythology, formation for you. But they obviously were of animals that didn't live in the neighborhood at the time. But they didn't think of them as being something from the distant past that no longer existed. They figured it was something that used to live around here that now lives somewhere else, which is why on a lot of old maps you'll see off the edges into the unknown parts of the world. That's where they expected to find the dragons, because that's what they figured the bones were of. So for a very, very long time, history, even though fossils existed and there was actually a huge market for fossils in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they were decorative, people bought them and traded them and all sorts of things. They didn't think of them as being representatives of extinct life forms. They just figured that they were things that had moved out of the neighborhood, basically, possibly driven out by humans or killed off by humans. They knew that humans could do that. And it took, kind of an expansion of humans across the world, eating away at the edges of that map until they finally got to the point they went, I don't know what we're digging out of the ground, but they don't appear to still be around. We'll come back and talk about fossils in a bit. The caption says, Alice, would you mind putting George Boy in the other room? Howard's allergic to great woolly mammoths. And when you're pulling dinosaur bones out of the ground, it's really hard to connect them through homology to things that exist today. It took a while of really understanding bits and pieces to do that. But digging out huge elephants with curly tusks that obviously were not like the elephants that live today kind of led people to the idea that forms that existed in the past don't exist anymore. And possibly the forms that exist today are actually descended in a changed form from the past, this idea of evolution. And then they ran into the church. And you're thinking, oh no, the church doesn't like evolution. No, that wasn't the problem. At the time, the idea that species could have died out in the past, could have gone extinct, was very much felt by the church to be against the Bible. It was blasphemous. Their opinion of Genesis was that Eden was created perfect by God. The only thing imperfect in Eden was people, because we were given free will, and that made us, dicey. But all the other animals and plants and stuff, they were formed perfectly by a perfect God, and therefore there's no possible chance they could have died out. That would suggest that there was something flawed about them. So the idea of extinction actually was fought over for a while when the church said, no, you can't have that. And we don't even remember that now, as things do change over time, even things that seem to be written much more solidly, like scriptural interpretations. And scriptural interpretations do definitely change over time. But before long, people started to understand a little bit about fossils and how they're put down. From the mixture of remnants of living things in sedimentary rock, they figured out it was sedimentary rock, that it was actually fossilized or petrified sediment that drops to the bottoms of bodies of water, encasing the things that don't get broken down, the hard parts of the shells and the bones and the teeth, and then more and more and more piles on top of it, compresses it, mineralizes it. And so when you're looking at layers of sedimentary rocks, you were looking at a history of a body of water that existed for who knows how long while the sediments accumulated. Most sedimentary rock that people were looking at is not underwater anymore. We now know because of the way that the continents move and things shift and things come up and down. But they knew at some point it was, because it's the only way you get clamshells and stuff in the sedimentary rock halfway up a mountainside. But then the question was, so if this is sedimentary rock and it was originally sediments, how old is this stuff? How far back are we looking at if deeper and deeper and deeper is older and older and older? And you get to a fellow named Lyell, who took an approach. I gotta be careful. It's a long word. I gotta make sure I spell it right. This is when science investigates things that are in the distant past or in the distant distance. They have to figure out how things work. They take an approach of, we can't go into the past, we can't go light years out into space. We're going to have to use what we know about how things work now and apply that as if they've always worked in the past and if they always work out in distant space. It's always been uniform. If we understand how sediments accumulate on the bottom of the oceans now, how much depth you get every year, and we're looking at the Grand Canyon, which is easily a mile of sedimentary rock, we can do the math. Is that if it accumulates a foot a year, how many feet in a mile? That's how many years it was. I'm making those numbers up. It winds up being a lot more than that. Also, as people studied these layers, they would find certain layers had certain mixtures of living things in them that weren't necessarily in the other layers. And the mixtures tended to be unique for different strata, different layers of sedimentary rock. Now, different parts had been high and dry at different points in the past. So you have a bunch of sedimentary rocks over here and a bunch of sedimentary rocks over here, but they represent different parts of the overall timeline. Well, if you can match the top 3 layers over here with almost at the bottom 3 layers over here, then they happened at the same time. And these are newer, so now you have newer history of sedimentary accumulation, and these are older, so you have older, and maybe you can find a place over here that it overlaps. So you match layers from different locations, and you drive the history farther and farther and farther back into the past. So we started out with thinking the world was fairly new. The people that think it's 6,000 years old, nobody really believed that at the time that this happened. Is that I think it's, some religious guy, I want to say Jesuit, but I don't want to say Jesuit in case he's not. Somebody named Darby, in fact, not Mick Darby, but Darby, in the 1800s, sat down and with an abacus and Genesis and added up all the ages and tried to figure out who overlapped who, kind of like this kind of matching. And came up for how far back creation was. And then when it didn't quite work out for Jesus to be born on the millennium, he fiddled it with it a little bit in order to get the numbers to work. But that's, before that, you know, a lot of religions that's tied to the Bible thought that the earth wasn't really, really, really old, but they didn't have specific numbers for it. The numbers came later. But eventually we realized extinction was a real thing. As Lyell accumulated more knowledge and other people accumulated knowledge, Earth got older and older as we understood more and more and more about it. Now we understand that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. It was a couple 100 million years old in that neighborhood when Lyell died. They'd accumulated that much overlap of different sedimentary rocks in different places. But they knew things had been around for a long time. The distant past didn't look like the present in terms of what was living there. That you can't find any hint of human beings in anything close to any of the deeper layers. Is that any of our stuff is up really close to the top. And so the idea of change over time, evolution started to become kind of an accepted idea about the history of the world. And there were some people that tried to make a push within the church. If you read the book of Genesis, creation happens twice, is that it tells you stuff and then it tells you all again, which is fairly common in the Bible. And there was a push among some people in the church that there had been 2 creations, and that we were created in the second one. And that's why there was all this stuff from the first one. But I think people were supposed to have been created in the first one too, so it didn't really completely wash. So early ideas, now we're getting up closer and closer. I'm giving you some of the things that influenced Darwin. Darwin was a pigeon breeder. It was his hobby. And it was very influential in his figuring out the idea of natural selection. We've given you kind of a preview of natural selection in chapter 1, so you kind of understand a little bit about how it works. And the original version of his big book on the origin of species talks a lot about pigeon breeding. I think 60-some pages or something. The word is, I read this somewhere, I don't know if it's true, that the publisher went to Darwin and went, you know, people are really interested in this pigeon stuff. There's all sorts of people breeding pigeon. Couldn't that just be the book? Do you have to have all this stuff about evolution in it too? Darwin went, no, it's pretty important to be in there. But the idea that you could pick who reproduces and change the nature of a breed of pigeon or cow or corn over multiple generations, so that eventually you had, well, think about dogs, is that you start with your basic wolf dog, and selecting for various traits, you can get Great Danes and Chihuahuas and Dachshunds and Beagles and Poodles. And if somebody came here with the species rules and wasn't here for very long, and they're going, I guess we're going to name them species if they're significantly physically different from one another, then dogs would be a bunch of different species. We know they can breed together, and they're only different because we've kind of made them that way. We've artificially selected for features, and we picked who breeds and who doesn't breed. And over time, in multiple generations, we've changed the nature of the breed. That was a hugely important idea for Darwin to find a way to apply to the natural world. Then we get to Thomas Malthus. I'm very sorry, there used to be a site I had linked to in the book that had a lot of Malthus letters and correspondence, where you could read his letters and find out he was not a particularly nice guy. He would, okay, I'm gonna say something somewhat political. He today would be a frequent contributor to Fox News. He lived in London. He did not like the fact that London was becoming more and more a place where there were a lot of brown people. You know, English, British Empire, people coming in from India, people coming from Africa, immigrants, even though from parts of the Commonwealth or parts of the empire. And he just feared the long-term effects of this mixing of the races. He put an essay out that didn't really talk about it, but kind of sort of talked about it. And he phrased the essay as stuff that happens in nature, but it was really a warning about stuff that happens with people as well. The idea of overpopulation. And his basic essay said, populations cannot grow exponentially forever. Is that if you get too much in a particular area, you wind up with running out of resources, running out of food, so you get famine. You wind up with diseases. They already knew that when you pack a lot of people together or on farms where you have a lot of animals and stuff together, that diseases run more rampant through a densely populated area. And with the lack of resources, it increases the possibility of conflict. So he was basically saying to the people that read between the lines that we're going to run out of food if we let all these people in, that we're going to have more problems with diseases spreading amongst, from the masses up to us good people. And we're going to get pulled into more wars as we try to provide for all of these extra people. But people that we would call biologists looked at it as actually fundamental laws of nature, which it is. I mean, in nature, there are controls on overpopulation, as populations can exceed their food supply. They can increase the odds of contagious diseases passing amongst them. And they can definitely increase conflict for territory and food and all those other things. Then we get to one of the great goats of biology, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who turned out to be very influential to a lot of people trying to figure out how evolution worked. And he came up with an idea that was kind of sort of right, but it had embedded in it some ideas about inheritance, about genetics, that turned out to be totally wrong. And it's the wrong parts that he's mostly remembered for, but there was an even wronger part, if that's a word, that doesn't want to go away, that's more insidious. So I'll cover the part he's known for. The famous story is giraffes. They knew from the fossil record that giraffes had not always been these long-legged, tall, long-necked animals, that their relatives looked more like okapis, which kind of look like a stunted giraffe. And here's the way that Lamarck presented their evolution. You have a population of pre-giraffes, giraffe ancestors, not really stretched out. And they're eating the leaves off the trees, and as they're doing that, they're stretching to get the higher and higher and higher leaves. Now here's postmodernism for you, influence of knowledge of the world. He knew, as a bunch of people did, that if you torture somebody by putting them on a rack, you put them on a rack and then you crank it and you stretch them out, you actually do, they didn't know this, but you expand the discs in their back and they actually wind up taller after the torturing. It does rebound after a while, but the idea that you could stretch and make something taller, he went, okay, so this is what happened, is that through their lifetimes, the giraffes are stretching and getting taller, stretching and getting taller, maybe not a huge amount of taller, but then they would have babies, and the babies would be born stretched out. And then they, through their lifetime, would stretch even more and produce even taller babies and stretch even more. And so the idea of changes gradually accumulating that are useful, because the height, reach more leaves, that turned out to be a really important idea. Turns out that isn't the way genetics works. You can't acquire something, through your lifetime and pass it on in its changed form to your offspring. But here's the deal. If you saw a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger's son, and he was really ripped, you'd go, well, of course he's Arnold Schwarzenegger's son. Now, Schwarzenegger was a world-class bodybuilder. So he was really muscular in his heyday. He can't pass the training onto his son. But we look at that because we know genetics and go, there must be some mixture of his genetics that gives him more of an ability to add, impressive bulky muscles, and that he could pass on to his son. It kind of looks like acquired characteristics, but it's actually embedded in his genetics. So it's not as straightforward a, wow, that's wrong kind of idea. Although I'm sure the dog breeders were saying, none of these short-tailed dog breeds actually are born with short tails. We clip them. Your spaniel's born, they clip the tail off. And they keep getting born with the long tails. So something's wrong with Lamarck's ideas. And eventually that part of his idea was kind of discarded. But the other stuff, was workable, it worked. Now, you can't forget that a lot of these people that we would call biologists were very religious. And Lamarck was very religious. And he thought it was part of his job to be able to explain, if people have not been around all the time, then maybe our creation was built. That evolution of the past was actually building itself gradually to us, the perfect, wonderful people. And so evolution as a pathway is making things better and better and better and better. And this is the idea that's really insidious, that people very often think of evolution this way, as being improvements, and sometimes as being part of a grand plan. But it's driven by changes in conditions, and those changes are random. So there isn't a plan. Things might get better at fitting into the current conditions, and that's wonderful, but when conditions change, all bets are off. So this doesn't really work this way. When you see science fiction stories that go, this is what we would look like in 5,000 generations, unless you're expecting modern conditions to never change during those 5,000 generations, and you're basically describing a fine-tuning approach. And that does happen in stable conditions. You don't know what 5,000 generations down the road anything's going to be, because you don't know what the conditions are going to change to and what's going to drive them to that. Okay, that's a place to stop. We'll pick up with Darwin next.